I'm sure you must have enjoyed your meal and you're back with a lot of energy for the next session. The Plenary 2 is focused on best value principles for procurement and investments, high standards, transparency, and sustainable debt. With that, I would like to invite the chair for the session, Dr. Arvind Mayaram, Mr. Tanaka, Mr. Abrajano, Mr. Kendall, and Mr. Wickramasuriya. Thank you, and I'll hand over the proceedings to Dr. Mayaram.
Thank you, Uday. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to remind you that if you intend to fall asleep after lunch, please raise your hand. We're going to discuss from now till 3 o'clock a subject which underlies all developmental processes, which is procurement of goods, services, and with public-private partnerships, we have seen procurement of even partners for development of projects. In South Asia, but also in the perspective of the wider region, which is the Indo-Pacific region, we are seeing increasingly the discussion of integration to increase trade, to improve channels of investment, which will lead to greater integration, leading to prosperity for people in the region. South Asia, in any case, is the house of very large number of poor. So is Southeast Asia. And therefore there is an urgent need actually to speed up the integration process, which will also allow the people living in these, the countries in the region to benefit from the development processes. Today we are talking about best value principle for procurement and investment. And when we talk of best value, we are talking of very high standards of transparency. We are also speaking about the transparency needs and also the one other important aspect, which is debt, because in countries like those which are in South Asia, there is always this great struggle between the developmental needs and the availability of resources. And we are seeing increasingly with rising public debt that fiscal sustainability of very high debt is now reaching its limits. There is much lesser headroom for borrowing than it used to be earlier. And therefore, there is need also to look at this whole issue that we might have very good standards of procurement, but we also need to look at how sustainable resources can be accessed by countries to carry forward this entire process. So we have a very illustrious panel today. We have Mr. Tomohiro Tanaka, who's Assistant Director, Development Assistance Policy Coordination Division, Bureau of International Cooperation, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan. Mr. Todd Abrajano, Senior Advisor to the Director, U.S. Trade and Development Agencies. Mr. Timothy Kendall, Economic Counsellor, High Commission of Australia to India. Mr. Wickramasuriya, Chairman, National Procurement Commission, Government of Sri Lanka. with very wide experience they will bring to bear on the discussions that take place today. The format, like in the last session that you've seen, the speakers will put forward their proposition for 5 to 7 minutes. And then we will have a discussion amongst the panelists, followed by open session with the delegates. So I would request Mr. Tanaka to come first and speak to us about his thoughts.
Thank you very much, Mr. Arvind, and thank you for inviting me. It's my pleasure to be here as a panelist. When it comes to enhancing connectivity, I believe that nobody will disagree with the importance of infrastructure. What do you think the most basic function of infrastructure is? I believe that the infrastructure should be to connect people and goods, which are underpinning the economic growth and sustainable development. When I was in Kenya as a diplomat from 2016 to 2018 last spring, I have seen the enormous demands of infrastructure. In fact, I have seen various infrastructure projects in Africa. But I encountered a serious, shocking incident, which was, as some of you remember through news, a $12 million US bridge collapsed before it was completed, and many people were injured. And after this news, I reaffirm that simply paving roads or building bridge or constructing ports will be not suffice to be infrastructure. Infrastructure should be follows the international standards on quality infrastructure. In this regard, Japan has promoted quality infrastructure. For example, in 2016, Japan, G7, under Japanese presidency, adopted G7 Iseshima principles for promoting quality infrastructure investment, which outline the elements of quality infrastructure. And now we have cooperated to elaborate these elements with like-minded countries, such as the United States and India, and other international organizations, such as OECD and G20. Let me touch upon some of examples of Japanese contribution to enhancing regional connectivity. High-speed railway project, which will connect the largest city, Mumbai, with Ahmedabad, a prospering commercial and economical city, will be a good example. As Ambassador Hiramatsu stated out in the opening session early today, the project will drastically reduce the traveling time from 7 hours to 2 hours from Mumbai to Ahmedabad. Another example of Japanese contribution to this region is cross-border network improvement project in Bangladesh. This project will increase intercity transportation and logistics network by developing international roads investment in Bangladesh, thereby contributing to increasing connectivity with neighboring countries, such as India, Bhutan, Nepal, and Myanmar. Despite of our efforts, the infrastructure finance is insufficient compared to the enormous demands of infrastructure in the world. For example, according to ADB, in Asia, the demand of infrastructure is projected to about 1.7 trillion US dollars, while only half of this demand is being met at present. And current ODA is no longer a major portion for flow to developing countries from developed country. That's why we need to utilize effective resource mobilizations. For example, PSI, private sector instrument, PPP, public-private partnership, and also, at the same time, debt sustainability is another important element to be quality infrastructure. Only borrower countries need to be followed, but also lender countries should be committed to debt sustainability. For example, Japan sets low interest rates and long repayment period for our concessional loans, with taking focus on borrowers' countries' debt sustainability, with utilizing tools such as debt sustainability analysis. So I believe both lender countries and borrower countries should committed to sustainable financing. In conclusion, Japan is now focusing on G20 Osaka Summit and TICAT 7 next year. Taking these opportunities, we are elaborating an international standard on quality infrastructure, including debt sustainability and effective resource mobilizations, addition to Ise-Shima principles. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Japan has taken a lead in providing not only financial resources but also technology transfer. However, the question of debt sustainability we'll have to explore a little more, because while the lender can certainly do an analysis of debt sustainability, but the question of availability of resources will still remain, and we'll need to explore a bit more. Todd, would you like to take a go?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Arvind, for hosting the panel today. I'm going to offer some prepared remarks, and then I look forward to the interactive discussion later on in the panel. You know, we're meeting at a very important time when countries are struggling to keep pace with global infrastructure demand, driven mainly by emerging markets like India. As countries invest in their infrastructure, we are witnessing an increasing awareness of quality and value for money in infrastructure spending. I'm pleased that CUTS International, FICCI, the East-West Center, and the U.S. State Department have added the discussion of best value principles to the conference agenda today. As a representative of the U.S. government and representing an agency that specifically works with U.S. companies on a daily basis, I know there are tremendous consequences for U.S. industry that produces some of the world's best goods, services, and technologies, as well as for our partners in emerging markets that cannot afford to waste money on poor quality infrastructure solutions. My agency, the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, has decades of experience operating in these emerging markets and has been leading the push for countries to focus on quality infrastructure investments and not simply the cheapest costs. We know that quality infrastructure drives economic growth and productivity, and at USTDA, we have a history of results that demonstrate the value countries achieve when they invest in sustainable infrastructure. USTDA supports early-stage project preparation work through the financing of feasibility studies, technical assistance, and pilot projects, which means we lay the groundwork for countries to make informed investment decisions based on quality solutions. Our unique mission is a win-win. While we help our partner countries advance their infrastructure goals, we also connect U.S. businesses to new export opportunities at the same time. We work in many emerging markets around the world. However, the South and Southeast Asia region represents one of our largest portfolios. Across the region, we are developing partnerships to improve aviation safety and efficiency, deploying innovative solutions for smart cities, and diversifying energy infrastructure, including renewable energy, natural gas, and cleaner coal. Through these projects, the agency has generated $14.5 billion in U.S. exports, supporting over 1,000 American companies here in this region. I'm happy to be here today to share some of our lessons learned when developing infrastructure projects and how to support the sustainability of those investments, as well as share some of our best practices for supporting procurement systems that prioritize high value and quality. I'd like to first turn to our experience improving connectivity in South Asia and where we have seen success. The U.S. government has made connectivity a centerpiece of its Indo-Pacific strategy, as evidenced through 3 new initiatives launched this past July, aimed at strengthening digital connectivity, improving infrastructure assistance, and supporting energy development. At the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, we are working to implement these initiatives and strengthen regional connectivity through our suite of project development tools that I mentioned earlier. Infrastructure development is fundamental to furthering regional connectivity. India is our largest market in this region. We have supported over 160 projects with strong partners from the government of India, as well as the private sector. We have also significant portfolios in Vietnam, the Philippines, and Indonesia. In assessing potential projects, we consider the local economic impact and, in some cases, regional impact. One example, as Ambassador Juster pointed out earlier, is in the aviation sector, where we have worked on a myriad of projects to support the forecasted growth in India and the surrounding region. Next, I'd like to focus on what USTDA does to promote sustainable, high-value public procurement and investment. In order to succeed in promoting and implementing sustainable, high-value procurements within any country, you must invest in your human capital. Countries must prioritize training procurement officials to a much higher level in order to transition to value-based procurement mechanisms. They need to understand and know how to apply and enforce international standards, as well as calculate the total cost of ownership using life cycle cost analysis to procure and implement higher value projects. You have to support the professionalization of your procurement workforce. One of the greatest lessons that we have learned is that even the best project plans can quickly change during the project implementation stage, and more specifically, during the procurement stage. Procuring quality goods and services can make the difference between successful project implementation and project failure. About 10 years ago, we started hearing from many of our partner countries about the difficulties they encountered during the procurement process, including a lack of international bidders, and feeling pressured to always choose the lowest priced bid, even when the quality of those bids was questioned, and how this greatly affected the outcomes of their procurements. We also heard from our U.S. industry partners that they were not bidding on these opportunities because the procurements were going to be awarded to the lowest cost basis without concern for quality or overall service, and they just aren't competitive in those types of tenders. In response, we launched the Global Procurement Initiative, GPI, Understanding Best Value, with the goal of helping our overseas partners obtain greater value and quality through their procurement processes, while at the same time leveling the playing field and fostering greater international cooperation and competition. The GPI provides training and technical assistance to public procurement officials through which we share best practices and ensure that our public sector partners are getting the best value for their money. The training enables them to establish policies that lead to overall government savings, more transparency, and greater value for public funds. The GPI has proven results. Since we launched the initiative, we have partnered with 11 countries and trained over 1,000 procurement officials. We will not stop there. We continue to hear from new countries that would like to partner under the GPI. In pursuing these ambitious goals, it has been important to develop a number of dynamic partnerships to drive success. We work with George Washington University's Government Procurement Law Program, whose world-class experts lead and help design GPI programs. We have also partners with Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, also known as METI, the World Bank, and we work regularly with the Asian Development Bank to leverage all possible resources and advance goals of our GPI partners. So far in the Indo-Pacific region, we have developed GPI partnerships with the Philippines, Vietnam, and the state of Maharashtra here in India. Lastly, I want to discuss what countries must consider when developing infrastructure projects in order to maintain sustainable debt levels. For USTDA, supporting the development of quality, sustainable infrastructure in emerging markets is a fundamental part of our mission. Through our many years of expertise, we have found that when countries procure based on low cost, they end up with major setbacks and sometimes even failures within just a few years. When governments spend large sums of taxpayer funds on infrastructure, they expect it to last for decades. They need it to last for decades so that they can pay off the debt they took on to build it. But procuring based on low cost tends to shortchange the goals of quality and sustainability. And there is nothing cheap about buying something twice. USTDA's experience and expertise have allowed us to identify 4 focus areas that can enable overseas governments to achieve value-based qualitative outcomes when implementing infrastructure projects. The first of those is project planning. The second is utilizing market resources and due diligence. The third is building that professionalized procurement system. And fourth is overall management of your contracts and your projects. And I'm happy to get into those in more detail as we go on, but in time consideration, I'll turn it back to you, Arvind, and can move on to Tim.
Thank you, Todd. I think that was very interesting. And as we discuss, we will perhaps have a little more details on some of these initiatives that you've taken. I request now Timothy to come in and.
Thank you, Arvind. What I wanted to do was probably talk about 3 things this afternoon. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Australian policy context, to identify some of the work that the Australian government's doing in terms of contributing to regional infrastructure, and then to outline some of the standards and principles that the Australian government promote as integral to sustainable and transparent infrastructure investment. I think, though, at the outset, we can comfortably say from some of the reflections of speakers today that the funding and supply of infrastructure is going to be one of the Indo-Pacific's greatest development challenges. And one of the figures or the metrics that the Australian government uses to understand the extent of this challenge is some of the ADB data that suggests that between now and 2030, the need for infrastructure finance for the region extends to about $26 trillion. And of that, you've got a significant component of that focuses on the power sector, but transport, telecommunications, water and sanitation are key components. In talking about the Australian policy context, I wanted to draw on 2 framework documents that we have. One is our foreign policy white paper that was released a year ago, and it frames Australia's foreign policy agenda around our commitments in the Indo-Pacific. From an Australian point of view, Australia is absolutely integral to what's happening in the Indo-Pacific because our island continent looks out over both the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And I guess where my perspective differs a little bit from some of the other speakers today is that while we're committed to the subcontinent and the South Asia region, we have a considerable presence in the Pacific Ocean, and our relationship with Pacific Island states is fundamental to what we do, particularly in our development program and infrastructure financing. The other framing document is the India Economic Strategy, which was a report that was produced by our former Foreign Secretary and former High Commissioner here to India, that looks at the bilateral relationship between Australia and India and the way that we're going to partner out to 2035. So this document really looks at areas of complementarity between our two economies. It looks at the way that we can take a sector and state-based approach to facilitate our engagement. But beyond that, I think it really commits to greater connectivity and regional investment in the subcontinent and broader region. I think what these two documents suggest to us is that a major change has occurred in the way the region is being understood as power shifts to the Indo-Pacific. And from our point of view, it's trade, investment, regional organisations and infrastructure that are starting to be used as instruments of influence to build strategic influence across the Indo-Pacific. Australia welcomes more investment in the infrastructure sector, and it's committed to working with partners, including government partners, multilateral development banks, international institutions, and the private sector. In terms of what Australia is doing to address the infrastructure gap, we spend about $490 million per annum, Australian dollars, to help support infrastructure in the region. And we probably do this in largely three ways. One is through our work with multilateral development banks, and primarily the World Bank, the ADB, and the AIIB. We're a founding member of the ADB and also a founding member of the AIIB. The second way that we look to make a contribution is through our core contributions to some of these international organisations, and particularly to their financing arms of the ADB, the Asian Development Fund, and to the AIIB. But probably one of the most important areas where we look to make a contribution is through working bilaterally with a number of our development partners. And this is very common in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And in the region here, we achieve this through the South Asia Trade Facilitation Program and the Infrastructure for Growth Program. In the Pacific, more generally, recently we've made major commitments to telecommunications infrastructure between Sydney, Port Moresby and Honiara. Just turning to the standards that the Australian government identifies for procurement and investment, I'd probably frame them in four different ways. So the first one is that investments should always be transparent, non-discriminatory, and promote fair and open competition. By that I mean that initiatives should not have any perverse effects on free trade or regional or global trade. It's also absolutely integral that risk across the project cycle is clearly identified in the planning stage, and the partners are given the capacity and the support to identify how they might be mediated. The second key criteria is that projects should always uphold robust standards. They should be driven by effective governance throughout the whole project cycle. Thirdly, investment should really meet a genuine need, and that genuine need should be driven by the end user's economic and social development objectives. Finally, as has been mentioned at a few junctures today, these financing initiatives should avoid unsustainable debt burdens, and lending proposals should contribute to the economic resilience of those receiving entities. So just in summary, I think a few key takeaways from this. I think I'd like to remind the audience that the importance of the Pacific component of the Indo-Pacific construct that Pradeep was mentioning this morning. I think there's an emerging discussion here about how we harmonise systems of procurement standards and principles for all, both borrowers and lenders. And that lends to itself to a discussion about the importance of establishing international norms. And a final comment, and I make this partly because there hasn't been much reference to it, certainly not explicitly today, but that's the importance of RCEP as a regional trade agreement and the way in which that will build trade connectivity across the region. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we move on to the next speaker, I'd like to remind the audience that there is an app, slido.com. Please make use of it if you have questions or even if you have brief observation. Please use the app, and it'll be easier for us to coordinate the questions from here. I request now, last but not the least, Mr. Wickramasuriya, who's chairman of National Procurement Commission in Sri Lanka, to make his observations.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Well, we heard, I will first, my deliberations will more or less focused on the best practices and principles that will require for better investments to bring into the countries and to improve the confidence of the stakeholders and the players who are participating in the economic development and the social development. So in that perspective, I would say that it's a challenge for each country in this region to invite the investors and then bring in them for the development of infrastructure and other related activities which need the social development of the citizens. In that perspective, I think everybody recognized that the procurement play a vital role. And so in that context, I would tell that it's very important for the players to bring in their investments or to make development partners with the individual countries. It's very important that confidence being improved within the country for the people to fearlessly come and invest and shake hands with the people. So, a good systems, transparent systems within the countries, and especially within the procurement, is very important. And it's widely spoken about. Procurement is one of the areas which leads to a lot of corruptions when it comes to the various procurements. So it's very important that you improve the openness and transparency by way of divulging information to all the people whom can be, I think, contested certain procurement decisions even. So in that respect, I would say that it is very important that inside each country, the procurement systems are being well regulated and managed. Now, for instance, I would tell you the example in Sri Lanka. We were practicing for several decades that an administrative system for procuring public goods. But then I think we learned a lesson by not flowing in fruitful investments into the country. So to improve the confidence and also to improve the competition of the government has recently revised the regulatory system by creating the National Procurement Committee, being oversight agency to look after the public procurement. So the country, now the procurement rules are being prepared to enshrine the basic principles of good governance, fairness, equality, transparency, and competitiveness, and the value for money, the cost competitiveness. So by that way, I think you can show to the others that you are. So in each of the procurement cycle, in each place, it's very important that we improve the transparency and fairness system. One of the things that generally comes into procurement is, except for I think certain things, open competition bidding can be promoted. But it's sometimes due to certain national requirements, you go for national competitive bidding, something like that, different bidding types. But we have decided to, I think, limit the number of, I think, restrictions placed on the open competitive bidding, thereby to allow the participants to come into the picture. Then the other thing is in the process, the transparency. That's the procurement, in the procurement process, the right of the players to appeal for the procurement decisions. So that has to be improved. Then only the confidence has to be. So why that I have not been selected or something like that at an institutional level. And then of course the appealing bodies, right from the appointment to the functioning of the thing, it's very important that I think they should be very independent and operating in good principles and openness. So the dissemination of procurement data is also very important, because the procurement data can be used by various people, departments, the research organizations to do research type of work on the procurements, so thereby to improve the systems further. So it's very important nowadays that with the technological improvements, to embrace the new technologies into the system and to conduct these things. One way to, I think, in procurement in most of this region, one of the, I think, problems is the involvement of the human and the limitation of the human capacities into the large-scale procurement. So it's very important that in that respect, we move towards a technological development, embracement of like electronic government procurement or electronic procurement systems to the systems, thereby employing more and more technological innovations into the procurement area, and also to build the capacities within the procurement staff who are engaged in this thing. And a lot of, I think, procurement staffs are not incapacitative in handling their activities. So it's very important that these things are built within so sound programs has to be brought in, I think, within regions, that in the countries to bring up the thing. In that respect, I would I would like to briefly touch upon there's a network program operating within the SAARC countries, public procurement network for South Asian region, SAARPPN, and which is the procurement institutions are networking within the inter-regional thing, so, inter-country partnership, and we share the knowledge of the procurement knowledge of each country, and thereby learning best practices and other things. So it's very important. In my concluding remarks, I would tell that it's very important to develop the procurement best practices and systems within the country for the investors to come and then invest it in a country, and then even the other regional countries to participate in your development activities. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me be a bit provocative, and let's see if we can make this a little more interesting. Todd, you were saying that you're running this training program, but I want to ask this question, which has, in various fora which has come up, and sometimes it is a matter of concern also to developing countries, that standard setting in itself can become exclusionary. For instance, we have found that in many countries, standards have become non-tariff barriers. So the standards are set in a manner that they favor, for instance, if they are G7 standards, and they would favor companies from G7 to be able to compete better, or may exclude a large number of others because the standards have been set in a particular manner. Do you think that is a genuine concern at some level?
Well, I think with respect to standards, you've got to look at it from sort of the buyer's perspective, right? When you're buying into large-scale infrastructure projects, you want quality. We've all heard these stories about how some of these projects have been built, and 2-3 years later, they're complete failures. And so when you're spending billions of dollars on a large-scale project, that's not the outcome you're looking for. So in terms of standards, there have to be some. And so with what we do at USTDA and our global procurement initiative, the standards that we set are set with respect to quality infrastructure and best value. And so we're not trying to exclude anyone, we're trying to include as many as possible. And so, as I mentioned before, the problem that we saw from the US perspective is that too many public tenders were looking just at low cost. And so the US companies weren't getting an opportunity to bid because every time they did, they were never winning. And so we wanted, through our program, to open it up to as many potential bidders as possible and not really exclude anyone.
Let me ask you this, that in the United States, when you do bidding, if your standards are for a nature which only would permit US companies, for instance, you could, while you're setting standards, the standards are not only in terms of quality parameters, but you'll also have financials. You could set a financial standard so high that companies from developing countries cannot compete. So quality in itself is a normative word which needs to be determined on the basis of a context. So would you think that could be a genuine concern, that when the standards are being set by the G8 or G7 or developed countries, you end up having this kind of an issue where you tend to move it in a direction which would help companies from those countries?
I certainly can see that argument. I think the bigger question is, ultimately, and back to what I said before, what do buyers ultimately want? They want the highest quality project that they can get for the best value. And so, and I can only speak for what my agency does. I can't speak for what other countries and other agencies do. But at USTEA, when we work with countries or we work with US vendors, we try to set the quality standards so that, as I said, as many countries or as many companies can bid as possible. We don't set standards at USTDA just for US companies. We just want to make sure that US companies can be included. And so what we found through the tendering process in the countries and the projects that we work on, there are bids from all over the world every single time. But the US companies are also at least allowed to bid and feel like they can compete. And so with respect to what we do, that's what we have found. But I can certainly see from the perspective that you brought up.
But Mr. Wickramasuriya, as the chairman of a procurement commission, does this question sometime come before you when you're looking at international competitive bidding processes, that the standards have been set in a manner which would be disadvantageous to, say, Sri Lankan companies?
I think if yes and no. I think if you look at the procurement per se, that the countries have a issue that what kind of standards that we are following. It's true that I think everybody is clamoring for the quality. But then to what kind of quality that we should go is an issue to be addressed by each country based on various other factors, not basically looking at the procurement per se. If you ask the various sectors, specialist sectors, they will say, we like to get the best kind of things flowing into our organization. But can the governments afford to invest like that, invest on like that? So it's a balance between the organizations and the people to make that what kind of thing in the procurement. But what's important is the value for money. So in the procurement, the very important concepts that has to be practiced is the value for money. And then ultimately see that whether it is fitting for the task. So in that perspective, I think we have to decide, because you have several standards and there's no harmonized standards in all of it. So you have the international standards, you have the British standards, you have the Japanese standards. The countries have their own standards. And the individual countries are trying to develop their own standards. Why? Why everybody can't fall in line with one standard? That's because each country has a unique value of identify certain things. So they try to standardize things, and while harmonizing with most of the international aspects, they want to bring in certain things that can be afforded within the standards. So it's very important that I think that whilst recognizing that the quality is very important, but how much that can the countries afford the highest qualitative things is an issue to be, I think, addressed by each individual country.
Now that brings us to a very interesting question, and Timothy, maybe you could step in and say that if each country is going to have like British standards or Australian standards and so on, then the issue of harmonization takes on that much more greater importance, because if we need to do cross-border, for instance, infrastructure, and we want more of connectivity, which will kind of increase the trade between countries and so on, then harmonization of in standards, not only in terms of trade facilitation, but also in terms of physical infrastructure, procurement for physical infrastructure development would also be important.
Yeah, thanks, Arvind. So to go back on to the question of standard setting and whether it can become exclusionary, firstly. So I guess two parts of this, you know, the importance of standards, I think, are, in one aspect of it is about protecting both borrowers and lenders in terms of you know, the topics that have been discussed here in terms of quality and value for money. And I think also Todd's comment here about that's about inclusion rather than exclusion. So I think they're kind of important framing principles. Beyond that, there's a secondary question here about bidding for contracts, large infrastructure projects. And this takes us back to the earlier discussion about human capital and the importance of building capability in areas of procurement and procurement management. On the issue of harmonisation itself, I think it's absolutely critical, and I think there's a role for some of the international organisations, the World Bank, the G20 and others to really take some significant leadership here to identify principles that are acceptable to both developed and developing countries.
In this context, has Japan ever come across similar issues when you have been providing assistance to other countries, including India, for instance, in the bullet train that is coming up now, the issue of the kind of standards that should be followed in procurement? Do you find that there is enough harmony or that there is need for changing those systems?
So when Japan offers our development assistance, it's based on demand-oriented from recipient countries. So it should be harmonized with developing countries' development policy itself. And we are closely cooperating with developing countries to enhance their economic growth and quality growth. Yeah.
Okay. Now, let me, before we open, I'll just raise two other questions which are, I think, important in the context of what we're discussing. One, of course, is this whole issue of life cycle procurement for you know, analysis, life cycle analysis in terms of getting the best price in, which in any case in public-private partnership projects, this is now generally being followed all over the world. But one question which has arisen, and especially in the case of India we have seen, is this whole issue of having procuring a partner for a long period of time in terms of the development of, say, a road project, and the life cycle is 25 years. Once you have contracted out the project, the economic cycles are now so short, as we've seen from 2008 or even before 2000 onwards, that it becomes extremely unpredictable to be having to have a very long-term relationship on a contract which is signed at one point of time, which may require renegotiations. But under the best principles of procurement, once the contract is a done deal, it should not be opened, because then it perverts the entire process of procurement. So how do you deal with issues of this nature in the current economic context?
Sure, I'll take a swing at that. You know, I think going back to sort of the last thing that I talked about in terms of sustainable debt, and we recognize there are four things. I think the very first thing that countries should look at when they're doing large scale projects is the initial project planning. They've got to figure out, you know, and they've got to spend time, and they've got to invest some money in trying to make sure that the project that they're actually putting together is the best possible project for them. And that encompasses everything, including any long-term agreements that they would sign. But I also talked about market research and due diligence. And I think in this particular question that this is key. You've got to take a look at not only the companies that you're signing deals with, you've got to take a look at the current economic conditions. And obviously it's hard to project over 15 or 20 years what the economies are going to do. But you've got to put yourself in the best possible position as well. And I think, as you mentioned, I think up front, being able to negotiate the terms of those agreements is the most important thing you can do. Nobody wants to enter into a contract that's going to tie them down to a bad deal over the course of 15 or 20 years. And so I really think that the early on negotiations is the best thing that they can do during that market research and due diligence phase.
Okay, let me just ask the last question and then we'll go to the audience. Now, one of the other issues that we have seen is the complexity of procuring infrastructure projects. These are large projects. When I was in Kennedy School at Harvard, when we were discussing this whole issue of development of a project for making it into a deal for private partners to come in, we were informed that in the United States now the time which it takes for the entire procurement process to complete is close to 5 to 7 years for a very large infrastructure project. And the question is that if we are going to make procurement, which is best principle procurement, which is going to be so complex, and I've seen in the UNECE also this discussion on in terms of how to make it completely foolproof in terms of transparency, etc. If it takes 4 to 5 years to really bring the deal out into the market, do we have that kind of time, especially in developing countries where the pressure of public expectation is so high, the election cycles are 5 years? Can you wait for projects to cook for that much number of years to get the best procurement principles in practice? Anyone would like to take a shot at that?
I'll jump in initially. We've actually seen this in my agency because, as I said, we're very early stage. We're early project development. So, the projects that we do, feasibility studies, those sorts of things, we are very early on. Those projects typically take anywhere from 6 to 12 months, just the feasibility study portion. And what we have found is that the longer a study can take, the quicker technology can change. And by the time you may be done with a feasibility study, there may be a new technology that comes out that you haven't even considered. And so I think that's obviously a huge issue. It's something that we are considering, and internally in our agency, we're trying to figure out ways that we can speed that process up in order to alleviate that very problem. So you're absolutely right. That's an issue that everyone needs to think about.
All right, I see questions coming up on the ticker, so let me take a few of those. So what are the initiatives taken to build the capacity of business sector to engage in transparent and standard procurement practices? Mr. Wickramasuriya, would you like to take that? Has the government of Sri Lanka done something to train the private sector? I mean, public official training is on, but...
Yes, I would say it's very important that I think we build the capacities not only on the public sector, it's in the private sector also, because we have found a lot of players who are taking part in the public procurements are not up to the certain qualities. So, and the knowledge that they gained through the processes are very small. So it's important that the national governments do, I think, take cognizance of this fact and then try to extend the development of capacities within the private sector also. And in that perspective, I think what's important is, I think, first, if you look at particularly in the Sri Lankan context, Sri Lanka doesn't have a public service for a procurement. Procurement playing a vital role in the public finances. So there's no general people who are participating in always the department procurement activities. So as a result, no persons who are permanently engaged in. So it's very important that service has to be regulated and their standards are being improved by way of, now say, we are thinking of introducing accreditation system to the public officers who are identified as a good procurement officers being accredited to a particular standards, and then they should compose of any of the procurement committees or things for a decision making process. So that's one kind of the thing. And the other thing is to include the procurement knowledge and procurement, the principles, theories behind the procurements into the curriculums of the universities and to the technical colleges who are playing a lower level role, so that I think when they are ready to take up the positions either in public sector or in the private sector to sharpen their knowledge, they are already gained knowledge as a contribution to the process.
We have another question here. Availability of credit is a bigger issue than sustainability. What about the availability of debt on non-recourse basis to private sector developers? Is there any thought on that, Timothy? How do you look at it? Especially, under the G20 initiative, Australia has set up a PPP hub, and which is looking at a lot of these kind of issues. Any thought on this?
So it's obviously one of the big challenges, the financing gap, and I think earlier the question was raised as to what type of instruments we could employ to try and draw more capital into the infrastructure basket, particularly as Mr. Tanaka said, at a time when development agencies around the world are reducing their spend. So I know within the context of the department I work for, we are trialling a range of instruments through which we can partner with the private sector in ways that have already been mentioned through PPPs, but also through impact investment funds, but also looking to broaden the range of partners that we can work with in delivering some of these projects, and particularly with the investors, the high net worth individuals, and also with some of the philanthropic capital that is there. So I think it's a way of trying to have more diversified settings, so we can seek capital from a range of different places and mobilise that in a way that enables it to grow.
Okay. Now we have this. I don't know. This sticker keeps moving up and down. So what's happening? Who's managing this? Why is government fund preferable than to the PPP fund under SDG projects? I not understood what the question is, but perhaps what we are speaking about is why is government funding preferred when it comes to SDG related projects instead of mobilizing private finance. If that is the question, then it's quite obvious that most of the SDG related projects are not commercially viable, and there is a very high regulatory risk there, especially because these relate to sectors like drinking water and so on, where which is very close to the people, and political preferences can change very quickly. So the risk perception is very high. But PPPs are not only BOTs. I think there's also a perceptual issue here, because you can have a public finance made available to the private sector to develop and manage so that private sector efficiencies are brought in, and also higher level of accountability. So that is being done in many places, and I I think it's wherever it's tried, it's working fairly well. Can someone in the panel throw more light on sustainable debt in the context of public procurement? Would anybody, you would like to?
So in the context of public procurement, light on sustainable debt, Japan, for example, Japan has invited public officials from developing countries such as Kenya and Mongolia for training in debt analysis and budgeting to their debt managing as a technical cooperation.
Let me put this in a different context, which is if you're talking of sustainable debt, which is sustainable public debt, obviously there is no answer to it because there are limits to which the governments can borrow, and they are determined by the kind of fiscal deficits they run on their budget. So the whole concept of having sustainable debt only simply means that you need to remain within your means. But if we are talking of sustainable debt on the projects, or where we are saying that how can we bring market forces to work on resource transfer to projects. For instance, capital markets, how capital markets can be tapped for public projects. Then of course there are several ways of doing it. In India, for instance, several instruments have been developed in this direction. Infrastructure business investment trusts are one, InvITs as they are called, which are a very tax efficient instrument to channelize capital market funds into infrastructure. Similarly, infrastructure debt funds are another instrument of the similar nature. So there are several you can have guarantees which are provided, or partial guarantees which are provided, or monoline wraps which can be provided to raise money from the capital markets for infrastructure projects. But I think for that we'll need another big session to discuss because it's a whole big, huge subject. Now there's a question there.
Thank you, moderator. I really need to add on that issue of sustainable debt on a macroeconomic level. Sustainable debt is like a moving goalpost. For instance, the United States, US economy has a 90% public debt GDP ratio. Japan has even higher, perhaps 160 or 200%. Bangladesh, as a developing economy, has a public debt GDP ratio of only 35%. Now, in the case of Bangladesh, of course, transparency and value for money is important when you take on debt. But as a growing economy, growing at 7% annual rate of GDP growth, it can definitely take on more debt, which is going to be sustainable, than another economy that is, let's say, growing at 5% and has a debt of 50% of GDP. So the point is, there's nothing sacrosanct about this debt sustainability number. No economist or financial expert has said the sustainable debt GDP ratio is 20% or 70% or anything. So we've got to be careful. When you invest in infrastructure, for instance, and if it's a public project, then you've got to do the due diligence, that's for sure. But as far as the debt capability is concerned, it's moving depending on the growth of the economy and the investments that you make and the productivity gains that you get from those investments. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions here?
Thank you, sir. Yes, I raised one question. Why is government fund is preferable than to that of public-private partnership projects under SDGs? Yes, your answer is partly satisfied. You know that in Bangladesh, there is a circular. Is a 30% of the total projects of an organization should be under PPP. But people are not coming ahead to participate in the
Can you please repeat the 30% of the?
total projects of an organization. Any organization, say individual organization.
What happens to 30%?
30% of the total project of an organization in Bangladesh.
I've not understood that.
You not understood? I say. No, in Bangladesh. It is, say, a Civil Aviation Authority of Bangladesh. I am the director there. There are many projects, but only one project is approved under SDG, I mean under PPP. It is maybe 2 to 3% of the total project. So I raised the question, why people are not coming to go ahead for the participation of development in the country. I think other countries also is the same, because if the projects are done by the private organization, they are not completing in time, they are not, I think, insufficient knowledge maybe, I think.
No, I think you have raised the point, and this was discussed by the panel also, that you need high quality procurement processes to be able to get best quality private sector partner to do the projects. And I think you have reiterated that point. So I think you have answered your own question, and thank you very much for that. But I think we need also to understand that PPP
Under BOT is
projects,
okay. But
the viability of projects is very critical to attract private investment. But we'll discuss this maybe subsequently. Any other questions?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I think we have no more questions there. I don't see any questions on the ticker either. Would any one of you like to kind of have the last word on this? Or each one of you can have the last word? The manner in which you would like to. Go ahead.
Thanks, Arvind. I'll go first. I think for me, one of the things that's been demonstrated by this this panel is just the need to invest in building human capability and understanding of procurement processes, and it's absolutely critical to try and avoid some of the pitfalls that might surround some of these large infrastructure projects. So I think it's incumbent on donors to talk to their partner countries about the way in which they can look to build human capital in the ways that the United States provides an interesting model.
Todd, would you like to say?
Sure, I'd just like to summarize by reiterating the point that when any country is initially looking at developing a large-scale infrastructure project, it's incredibly key to start early, spend and invest on the feasibility portion of that project, know exactly what it is that you want before you go in, and then utilize a professional procurement system within your country in order to ensure that you get that. After you've done that, you've got to make sure that you're consistently and continuously monitoring that project and making sure that the contracts that you've signed are being followed to a T. If you can do that, I think most countries are going to find that they're going to be able to build long-term quality infrastructure projects that last.
So thank you very much, and I'd like to point out one thing, that Japan is going to host G20 Osaka Summit next year, so we are going to elaborate an international standard on quality infrastructure through these kind of discussions in inclusive manner and with developing countries as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I wish to reiterate once again that I think it's very important, I think, to bring in the investment into the country, they improve the confidence on the systems that are available, plays a vital role. So it's in that perspective, I think you have to reform within your country certain systems with outward looking, and then I think reform them both regulatory wise as well as in the institutional wise to invite more fruitful investment into the picture. And at the same time, it's equally important whilst doing that, the regulatory and the structural regimes in the macro level and at the institutional level, it's very important to build the capacities that are necessary among the staff of the bidders as well as the officers, and also to embrace as much as possible the new technologies that are being, I think, practiced in a lot of developed countries in the procurement processes.
Thank you very much. I think I would like to thank all the panelists for having put forth very clearly some principles which are important. I think we are very clearly in consensus that to procure good quality infrastructure, it is important to build upon the best practices and also the principles of procurement. We must also remember that if the procurement process is robust, transparent, and builds confidence in the markets, it is also easy when we are talking of sustainable debt. It also becomes easier for the governments to be able to go and access capital markets for their public projects and therefore reduce the debt of the government or also reduce their own fiscal deficits. So I would like to thank all of you, and also I would like to thank the audience who, after a wonderful meal, I didn't see one single hand raised, so I don't think anybody slept. If they did, they must have done very quietly. Thank you very much, and I will hand over the proceedings to the.
Thank you, Dr. Mayaram. And thank you to all the panelists. I think the session was extremely interesting, and that's one reason why we didn't find anybody falling asleep just right after the lunch. So with that, thank you to all of you once again, and request my colleague Susan to hand over the token of appreciation. Thank you once again, and we shall now break for a cup of tea, and we'll be back in this room at 3:30 for the last plenary. Thank you very much.